Okay, friends. So today's module, as you have seen already, is about the burial record and funerary practices of the Upper Paleolithic. And one of the reasons that I've decided to include a module on this is because um, it's my specialty. It's what I do. It's what I love. And I always think that when I was a college student, and even when I started grad school, I always think it's interesting when professors talk about the thing that they do. Um, and that they specialize in, because it's one of the reasons that you study in the college level with a professional archaeologist and not like a K-12 teacher. And so I wanted to talk a little about this. I also think this funerary practices and burials and things like that are just so fascinating. And I think that it's just a really great thing to explore because it's a great case study to look at the development of complex cultural practices through time. So when we talk about the burial record today, we're going to start way back in early human evolution and trace it all the way through the Upper Paleolithic. And then when we get to the Mesolithic and the Neolithic in the next few modules, we'll continue to trace this through time. And I think it's just a great way to illustrate and to see how these complex cultural traits develop. Because as we've been talking about, there are very few revolutions when we talk about human culture and human society. And burials and funerary activities and ritual and all those are same. They're just playing on forms that were created very early in our human evolutionary lineage. And that's what I want to get at today. So these lectures aren't going to be super long. I've been trying to slow down the amount of workload in the course as we come to a close, as I know that you're finishing up your papers and you'll want to start working on revising your portfolios. And so, let's get to it. Let's just have fun. I think this is really interesting stuff, and I'm really excited to explore it with you. The first thing we need to recognize before we get started is we need to say that there are multiple kinds of different types of funerary behavior that a human or human society or any other organism can practice. And that burial is only one form of funerary activity, right? So we've got things like morbidity behavior, which is if we're ranking these different behaviors, is probably the lowest level form of funerary behavior. And when we talk about morbidity, what we're talking about is pretty much any kind of recognition that another organism that is in your group has died and that you somehow mark or recognize that death. So, we're going to talk about in a minute, but all human funerary activity is morbidity behavior. Chimpanzees have morbidity behavior. But if you look at like an ant that's crawling, if you smash on an ant, the other ants just run. But they're not going to be like, oh, poor little Freddy, the ant that got smashed. They're just going to try to escape because they are in danger as well. They do not practice morbidity behaviors. So at the end of the day, at the simplest level, when we talk about morbidity behaviors, we're just talking about any recognition that a member of your group has died. Right? The second one is Chronos compulsions. And this is a step up from morbidity behavior because now we're starting to do something else with the body. And a lot of Chronos compulsions is consuming or doing something else with the dead body. So cannibalism does fall under Chronos compulsions. And we're gonna track this development through time. So I think it'll be relatively clear to you why we're defining all these different terms. But for now, just know that Chronos compulsions are just an expanded form of morbidity behavior because now it's not just recognizing that they're dead, but it's consuming the dead body. Now, this can be just because or nutritional cannibalism. This can just be because you need to eat to survive, or this can be ritualized. There's also what we call structured abandonment. This is a type of funerary behavior where someone dies in your group and you don't bury them. You don't build anything for them. You don't build like a monument or a grave or anything like that. But instead, you just leave them where they are. Maybe you put a few rocks around them. Maybe you say a few words of remembrance or you practice some other small scale ritual. But structured abandonment is the idea that where you leave them where they died, you leave them where they lay, but you do recognize it and you do mark it as a sad or memorable occasion. Then we have funerary caching. And funerary caching is a type of behavior where people will put parts of bodies or whole bodies into one place. So we're going to see this in the Mesolithic and the Neolithic, where people are going to take like parts and bones of their deceased relatives and ancestors, and they're going to like put them in a hole together under the ground, like, or they're going to put them and build them into the foundations of houses or into the walls of houses. This is not burial because you're not burying the whole individual, but you're taking particular parts of the individual and putting them places, but is going to be evolutionarily a lead up to burial. We also have cairn covering. This is where you build rocks up and above somebody. So you don't bury them into the ground, but you leave them on the surface and you build rocks around them. Ornamentation is where you turn human bodies or parts of bodies into ornaments. So this is where you'll take like human teeth or like human spinal bones, and you'll like the vertebra, and you'll turn them into necklaces or earrings or a crown or bracelets. Is anything that you turn a part of a human body into something that you wear. Then we have formal burial and inhumation. And this is what we talk about when we think about like burial itself. And burial can be primary or secondary. So primary burial is when you bury the person into the ground and you leave them there. Secondary burial is where you bury the person in the ground, you dig them up, and then you take parts of their body or their whole body and put them somewhere else. Burials can be individual burials or group burials. So you can bury one person at a time or multiple people in a single grave. And sometimes burials can retain their anatomical connections. So, it's kind of like when you have that perfect skeleton, or you can do things that are like commingling, which is where you throw a bunch of skeletal elements together. You don't really care what's mixing or what's there or what's not. You just throw it all together into one place. Right. And then we have cremation, which is ritual burning of the body to dispose of it and turn it into ash. Oh, and then there's detachment, which is detachment is a ritual thing. It's not a physical thing you do with the body, but detachment is the process through which you say that person is dead. That person is no longer a part of this realm of existence. They're no longer part of the physical world, but are doing something different. They are somewhere else. So detachment is a ritual process. It's a psychological process in which you recognize that this person is no longer alive. And it's that process that you go through. And then commemoration is when you come back to remember the dead. It's any kind of memorial service, perhaps shortly after they died, perhaps years after they died, but it's any way that you commemorate the dead. So these are all of the different types, and I think this encompasses all types of funeral behavior that are recognized by humans, but this is all the different ways that you can deal with your dead. You can just recognize they're dead, you can eat them, you can just leave them where they lay and be like, peace out, kid. You can cache parts of their bodies, you can cover them in cairn, you can turn them into body ornaments, you can bury them, you can cremate them. You can go through all of these rituals and psychological processes to detach from and commemorate the dead. What I want to get clear is that there's a lot of diversity in the different ways that people can conceptualize death and funerary behavior. All right. This does take us into a big issue, and we kind of talked about this issue when we talked about the Neanderthals, which is that there is a difference between burial and disposal, right? Burial is ritual. Burial implies that you have some cosmological or religious or ritual reason for putting the person in the ground, right? It means that it's accompanied by other aspects that we would associate with ritual. Things like ceremony, things like grave goods, things like particular people who can and cannot be there. It is a ritual thing. Disposal, on the other hand, is this idea that you're just getting rid of the body because it's garbage, because it's stinking up the cave, or you're afraid it's going to attract predators. So disposal of the body is when you put you put the body in the ground, not because it's any part of your belief system, but because you just want to get rid of it. And so one thing that we're going to examine in this lecture and this module is, when did our treatment of the human body go in our evolutionary lineage go from disposal to burial, right? Because the problem is as like what we talked to the Neanderthals, we do have some Neanderthals that are buried in the ground. But was that a ritual, cosmological, complex social organization type of thing? Or was it just them trying to dispose of and throw away the body because it started to stink up the cave and it was starting to attract predators? And that's something that archaeologists are going to grapple with for a very, very, very long time. So to grapple with this, archaeologists have developed 8 criteria. I know it's a 7, but it's 8. It is 8 criteria for defining burials, all right? And I'll move my face so you can read these. So the first criteria is the presence of an anthropogenic pit, meaning a human-made grave or other pit to put the body in, and or architectural elements such as stones, bone, or wood. So what this means is that someone intentionally dug a pit and then built something around the pit to mark it. Number 2 is that the individual is associated with grave goods, so that there are objects, important objects that are being buried with the individual that were either important to the person in life, or kind of you think of like the pharaohs and the pyramids, things that will be important to them in death. And then finally, the presence of some kind of dyes. So like using red ochre to color the bodies, or other kinds of pigments and other things to ritually color certain parts of the body for whatever religious or cosmological reasons. Right? These first 3 criteria are the most important. If we find archaeologically any of numbers 1 through 3, we know that it is a burial and that it is not disposal, because they are doing something extra with the body, right? However, there are 5 other things that can also be used to strengthen or not strengthen our assessment that something is a burial versus random disposal. So the first thing is representation rates of the skeleton. So how much of the skeleton is present? Is the whole thing present? Because if somebody was intentionally buried, we would expect the whole skeleton or nearly the whole skeleton to be there. 5, anatomical connections, meaning do we see that the like the lower arm bones are connected to the upper arm bones, which are connected to the shoulder blades, which are connected to the vertebral column, which is connected to the skull, which is connected to the other arm, which is connected to the pelvis, which is connected to the leg bones. Do we see these anatomical connections in place? Right? If they're buried and it's ritual, you will probably carefully put into the pit. So these anatomical connections are still there. If you were thrown away, these might not be there. Position of the bodies. If we find regular patterning of that the bodies are all facing east, or they're all oriented north-south or something like that, we would definitely notice that they were probably burials. How many individuals? If you have 3 bodies that are all buried at the same time, all in the same position, starting to indicate that that might be intentional. And then finally, that these are places that are frequented by humans, that this is a place where humans could have come and buried it and also come back to commemorate or memorialize the dead. Now, the criteria 4 through 8 are not smoking gun proof. They are not unequivocal proof that this is a burial and not just random disposal. But the more of those that you have, the more and more likely it looks that this is going to be an intentional burial. So what does all this mean? Why is this all important? Well, when archaeologists want to go back to the archaeological record and say, when are the earliest human burials? When do we start practicing funerary behavior in this way? These are the criteria that we have to use to assess whether a Neanderthal burial or a Homo erectus burial or even a Homo sapien burial are actual burials or not. So these criteria are designed to help us assess what is the evolution and the prehistory of human funerary behavior. Because again, we as archaeologists of the prehistory, we can't see these things happening. So we have to have criteria, scientific parameters in order to assess whether something is a burial or not. So let's go back to try to figure out when did burials first appear in the archaeological record? What is the evolution of human funerary behavior? So the first place we can make a pit stop are chimpanzee burials. And so chimpanzees, we want to look at because we see them as being much more simple and quote unquote unevolved than humans, which is a problematic way to assess them. We have to be careful not to think of chimpanzees as just being analogous to the last common ancestor between humans and chimpanzees, because just like humans have been evolving over the last 5 to 7 years, so have chimpanzees. But they're usually a good place to start because we can say that anything that we have in common with chimpanzees, our last common ancestor probably also had. It's also a good thing to contrast human burials and chimpanzee burials to say what makes us different, what makes us unique. So the first thing that I want to note about chimpanzee burials is that chimpanzees have a clear manifestation of morbidity by individuals who had a close relationship with the deceased chimpanzee, right? So they do a lot of things. They groom the corpses of the deceased chimpanzee. Mothers will carry around, or what we call curate, the corpse of a young child who died up to a month after death. Chimpanzees will hang around the deceased individual for like hours until death. They'll repeatedly examine and poke at the corpse. We've also noticed as anthropologists that the group kind of comes together and there's heightened group interaction and cohesion when a death in the group occurs. Chimpanzees will control access to who can actually see the deceased individual. And there are very clear mourning signs. Chimpanzees will express signs of depression, calls, and particular sounds, and also, carrying around the corpse, showing the corpse. What this all proves to us is that chimpanzees recognize when a group of their number dies, and they actually mark it in some important way. They're not necessarily having important rituals. They don't necessarily have larger cosmological or religious beliefs that make this important, but they do signify that the death of an individual in the group is a really big deal, and it's an emotional time. This is what we mean by morbidity behavior. Again, what I said, this is the simplest kind of funerary behavior. It's just a recognition that a death has occurred and that death has importance. Right. So that's all we really see, though, for chimpanzees. We don't really see them doing any of the other kinds of funerary behavior that I talked about earlier. However, across the genus Australopithecus and across Homo, really from Homo habilis through Heidelbergensis, we see two new traits developing, though, when it comes to funerary behavior. One is that we start to see people, or our early hominid ancestors, treat the bodies a little differently. So we have the appearance of those chronos compulsions, things like cannibalism and other early treatments of the body. So that's the first thing. And we'll talk about those. The second thing is that we're going to start to see that people are starting to place more emphasis on particular places and spaces in the landscape, funerary caching. So what we're going to start seeing now is that not only are people starting to recognize that the dead body is important, but we're also going to start recognizing that we're going to start associating certain places with death. Now, this is probably going to be disposal at this point. We have no evidence of intentional ritualized burial, but before you can get to burial, you have to mark the landscape in a particular way. In other words, today, when we think about burying the dead, we think about cemeteries, where we recognize that there is a particular place where it is appropriate to bury the dead. It is not appropriate to bury a dead body like behind, I don't know, Mountain View, right? Because we see that as not being a place that is associated with the dead. So what I'm all getting at is that before you can get to human burial, you need to be able to get to the point where you start to say, there are places that I associate with death, and there are places that we do not associate with death. You need to start making that distinction, right? So let's look at some examples of where these early treatments of the body and these funerary caching behaviors started to emerge. One is the Hadar site, and the Hadar site is where Lucy comes from, that we talked very briefly about in an earlier module. And what we see is that this is a place where 13 individuals were found dead. And some archaeologists have said that this is evidence of early funerary caching behavior, that Australopithecus afarensis recognized that there's an important place on the landscape that we associate with death, and we're just going to put the bodies here. It wasn't ritual, it wasn't cosmological, it was pure disposal, but you are recognizing that you have to dispose of human bodies or hominid bodies in a particular place. Second, at the early hominin Australopithecus site of Sterkfontein in Africa, we have evidence of cannibalism and Crohn's compulsions. At Grandolina, this is Atapuerca, which we talked about earlier. It's the earliest site that we have in Europe. We also have evidence of Crohn's compulsions. Several individuals were clearly processed, and this is likely nutritional cannibalism. There's likely a time where there was not a lot of food available for whatever environmental reason, and they had to turn to cannibalism to eat. This is important. Early cannibalism is actually important to our understanding of the human body and our symbolic understanding of the human body. Because cannibalism is a really intimate experience. When you're eating someone, it's weird to think about, but you are becoming very, very close with that person. And so we would have increased our knowledge of the human body that eventually would have led to more formalized and ritualistic funerary behaviors. So that's why treatment of the body is so important, because just like we have to mark certain places on the landscape before we can get to our modern conception of funerary activities of like cremation and burial, you also have to start recognizing that certain treatments of the body are appropriate upon death. Right? We've also talked about the Cima de los Huesos very briefly, but here we have a lot of human remains that people would just dump into this cavern over a long period of time. Again, another way in which people are trying to reconceptualize where death is appropriate and spaces where death is inappropriate. And then finally, at the site of Bodo in South Africa, 600,000 years ago, we have a Homo heidelbergensis skeleton, and there's more evidence of Crohn's compulsions and defleshing here. By the time we get to Neanderthals, as we've kind of talked about very briefly, we start to get to some things that look a little more complex and a little more refined than just funerary caching and Crohn's compulsions. There are at least 30 Neanderthal burials that were buried over a 30,000 year period in at least 3 regions of Eurasia, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, and the Near East. All of these Neanderthal burials date from about 70,000 to 34,000 years ago. We have clear evidence of funerary caching behavior with Neanderthals because we find that Neanderthal burials aren't evenly distributed across the landscape, but occur in certain pockets. And so again, this shows us that Neanderthals had this idea that the removal of the dead had to happen somewhere and that it had to happen at a very particular place. And this is a further development of an enculturation of the landscape, where the landscape is gaining cultural and social significance, where there is this idea that there is an appropriate place to bury your dead and an inappropriate place to bury your dead. We also have evidence of very intense ritual treatments of the body among the Neanderthals. For example, at the cave site of Grotta Guattari in Italy, we know that Neanderthals were processing the soft tissues of dead Neanderthal bodies. This was probably not cannibalism. We have no evidence from anything, including genetic evidence or isotope analyses or anything, that Neanderthals were eating each other, but was probably some kind of ritual defleshment, where part of their ritual, part of their cosmology, part of their worldview was that you needed to take the flesh off of a dead body before it can be, before it can do whatever belief in the afterlife or whatever Neanderthals believed. Neanderthals, grave goods are not common for Neanderthal sites and were probably not present really much at all. And so people weren't really being buried with things. They would bury individuals with maybe some red ochre, but they weren't burying them with any other objects. And this is because the idea of grave goods is another leap in social complexity than just burial. So treatment of the corpse, defleshing, putting them in a particular place, that's just a logical extension of the social role of the body in life. And what I mean by that is that this kind of treatment of the corpse is just, okay, this person was alive and I really liked them when they were alive, and now this person is dead, and I kind of just want to do right by them because they're dead. right? And I still see them as the person that they were, and I want to have a lot of places where I can remember them and that things are going well. However, great good starts to get beyond that and starts to get into metaphysical issues. It starts to get into issues of do you need things with you after death? Um, are objects and the items that we possess part of our identities and part of our self-expression? What does it mean to own something, and do you retain ownership of that when you're dead? These are like higher level philosophical issues that the Neanderthals may have just not been considering, and that only really became common with Homo sapiens. Still up for debate, but that seems to be what's going on. And again, this is why these questions are so interesting, because it's not just an issue of were there great goods or not, but these bigger issues. Some other important things that we see with Neanderthal burials, as I said earlier, they occur in 3 geographic clusters: Western Europe, which incorporates France, Belgium, and Germany; Eastern Europe, where we find Neanderthal burials in Ukraine and Russia; and Central Asia and the Southwest, where we find Neanderthal burials really concentrated in Uzbekistan. In Neanderthal burials, all ages are represented. Although we do see that, especially compared to Homo sapien burials that we'll talk about later, that there are a lot of children, a lot of juveniles, and a lot of infants. This indicates to us that 2 things. One is that Neanderthals had high infant mortality, that a lot of infants and young children were dying and not living to adulthood. And 2, that these young children and infants were given and seen as being full persons in this society. One thing that we know from just ethnographic things and other archaeological sites is that children and infants aren't always granted full personhood into a society. Sometimes you don't become a full person until puberty or until you reach like 5 years old or 7 years old. It varies. And so they won't name you, and they see you as a human, and they'll feed you and they'll take care of you, but you aren't seen as a full participating member of society. It's similar-ish to like how in the United States, you only become a true citizen when you become like 18, when you vote and join the military and all these other things. And before that, you're not really seen as a full citizen. Same thing, but take it as personhood, actually seeing you as a person and a member of the group. But if Neanderthals are burying these individuals and giving them the full burial and ritual, hullabaloo that they're giving everybody else, then they're probably seeing them as full members of that society. The majority of Neanderthal burials are oriented east-west, meaning that burial probably had some kind of astrological connection, because for some reason where the sun rose and where the sun set was probably important to them. It's, not all burials have this pattern, but most of them do. And the one thing about Neanderthal burials that's different than Homo sapien burials is that Neanderthals are buried in like the areas of prosaic everyday life. Sometimes Neanderthals are just burying people where they died. This isn't structured abandonment, because structured abandonment is you just say, peace. No, this is where you're actually putting them where, like, you're actually just saying, okay, if we're out on a hunting trip and you die, we're not going to bring you back to the camp. We're just going to put you out here, right? And so what we're seeing is that the Neanderthals are having a lot of important things about death, but what's really interesting here is that while Homo sapiens like to say this is a ritual space that's away from where we're living, like the death space is different from everywhere else, the Neanderthals are kind of like, you want to be buried in the middle of our camp, we're going to bury you in the middle of our camp. We're going to bury you wherever. So the connection to specific death spaces is not as strong as with Homo sapiens. So to recap where we're getting, we don't see any formal burials until 120,000 years ago, where there's a deliberate creation of space to deposit and cover a corpse. So I do want to make that clear. Everything we've talked about so far is not a formal inhumation or burial, except with some of the stuff for the Neanderthals. Right? Burial as a practice, as a funerary practice, originated in the Near East. We know that there's other kinds of morbidity behavior and funerary behavior before this. So those Kronos compulsions among Homo sapiens in Africa and before then. But the first Homo sapien, modern human burials, comes about in the Near East, right? We don't see humans, Homo sapiens, burying their dead until after they leave Africa, right? The earliest human burials come from a site called Skul in Israel, where we have a modern human burials dating from between 100,000 and 120,000 years ago. We also have more human burials in Qafzeh in Israel, where we have 13 complete or nearly complete Homo sapiens dating between 90,000 and 100,000 years ago. And then our first evidence of human burial in Africa comes from a site of Border Cave in South Africa. And that burial dates to about 70 to 80,000 years ago, right? So if we're looking at the Homo sapien burial timeline, what we're seeing is that 150 to 160,000 years ago, Homo sapiens are in Africa. They're doing mortuary defleshing and they're curating crania, meaning they're taking the heads and putting them in a particular place. They're just kind of caching the heads. By 90,000 years ago, we're starting to see funerary caching and the first formal burials. This is also the first time that we're associating burials with grave goods and using like ritualistic fire. And then by 40 to 60,000 years ago, so the advent of the Upper Paleolithic, we're starting to see simple inhumations happening in Africa, the first inhumations and cremations in Australia, and we're going to start seeing the first burials in Europe as well. So the point of this slide is that even when Homo sapiens emerge, we're not going to start seeing burial right away. We're still seeing this development of these morbidity behaviors, these treatments of the body, associating places with landscape, and that the origins of burial as the predominant human funerary practice is taking place over tens and tens of thousands of years, right? So to recap everything we've done so far, we essentially, human morbidity behavior occurs in 3 stages across the Stone Age. The first is the Pliocene hominids, so really anyone before Homo, where there's a lot of Cronos compulsions, some evidence of infanticide, some evidence of cannibalism. There is socially mediated morbidity of the corpse, meaning that there is people who are structuring access to the corpse. This is really coming from our evidence from chimpanzees. Again, chimpanzees are showing us that these people probably had light mourning behavior, and maybe some funerary gatherings and social theater. So what we call a funeral, but in a very low level way. Stage 2 occurs in the late Australopithecines and early Homo. This is where we see the continuation of those Cronos compulsions, morbidity behavior, and mourning. But now we're starting to incorporate particular places on the landscape that become important for mortuary activities. So it's in this middle period, stage 2, that we see the origins of funerary caching. And then stage 3 is the Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens, where we continue to see Cronos compulsions, morbidity behaviors, mourning, funerary caching, social theater, things like that. We now have a clear association with places on the landscape being associated with the dead. But also now we're developing this formal burial from earlier funerary caching. We're seeing places with multiple burials, so very, very early cemeteries. We don't really start calling things cemeteries until like the very late Upper Paleolithic into the Mesolithic. And also the incorporation of grave goods. So in the next lecture, which is much shorter, we're going to talk just a little bit about, okay, now that we're in the Upper Paleolithic, what does the burial record look like there? But I hope this was a clear and interesting look at how funerary behaviors develop through time. I love this stuff. So if you have any questions, shoot me a message on Slack, shoot me an email, come to office hours. I'd love to talk to you about this.